To be a soldier, Rupert Everett once said, one needs that special gene, that extra something that enables a person to jump into one-on-one combat. Something, after all, that is unimaginable to most of us, as we are simply not brave enough. Still, not many soldiers fit that description. Even fewer carry the weight of two nations on their shoulders, like Major General Fred Rwigyema, the subject of this video. In Uganda, he helped overthrow a brutal dictator and played a decisive role in the creation of a new army that would shape the country's future. In Rwanda, Rwigyema led a generation of exiles who refused to die in silence, launching a daring invasion that changed the course of history. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the story of Major General Fred Gisa Rwigyema, the soldier who fought for Uganda, the hero who died for Rwanda, and the legend who still lives in the memory of both. He was born Emmanuel Gisa on April 10, 1957 in Gitarama, southern Rwanda, but history would come to know him by another name, Major General Fred Rwigyema. In 1960, when Fred was just 3 years old, his world was turned upside down. The 1959 Hutu Revolution had swept through Rwanda, bringing down the monarchy and driving hundreds of thousands of Tutsis from their homes. By 1964, nearly 200,000 Rwandan Tutsis were living in exile, scattered across the region, carrying a quiet pain and an unspoken hope that one day they would return to their motherland. Fred Rwigyema and his family were among them. He and his family fled across the border to Uganda, finding shelter in Churungezi refugee camp in Ankole. Later, they moved again, this time to Kaunji in Toro. For the next decade, camp life was all Fred knew. In 1963, amid the hardship in the camp, Fred met another boy. His name was Paul Kagame. They were roughly the same age, shared the same struggles, and attended the same school when school fees allowed it. Eventually, they went their separate ways. Fred Rwigyema enrolled at Mbarara High School. Kagame moved to another. But even then, their paths were never far apart. They would meet again and become brothers in arms. More on that later. At Mbarara, Fred connected with other Rwandan and Ugandan students. It was here that his sense of purpose began to take shape, not as a refugee, but as a freedom fighter in waiting. Then came January 1971. General Idi Amin seized power in a coup. In the blink of an eye, Uganda's fragile politics shifted, and with it, the position of the Banyarwanda, the ethnic group that included Fred and other Tutsi exiles. General Amin saw them as potential allies against Milton Obote. He brought some of the Banyarwanda into government, placed others in security roles. But what rose quickly would fall hard, because when Milton Obote returned to power in 1980, retribution followed. Under Milton Obote, the same Banyarwanda were branded collaborators, but more on this later. Around this time, when Idi Amin was in power, Fred Rwigyema, like many others, had to choose a side. So, some of the Banyarwanda aligned with Amin's army, but others joined a growing resistance movement, the Front for National Salvation, or FRONASA, led by a young revolutionary named Yoweri Museveni. Ever heard of him? Yeah, just that guy who's been running Uganda for the past few decades. Anyhow, Yoweri Museveni believed Uganda needed a revolution of its own to free the people from Amin's tyranny. Fred Rwigyema's path to the battlefield began in 1976. He was still a student at Mbarara High School when opportunity, or perhaps destiny, came knocking. It is said that Kahinda Otafire, then a civil servant in the Ugandan government, had been quietly recruiting for FRONASA. And so, Fred was one of the three chosen from the school, alongside fellow student Shefe Ali and their teacher Ivan Koreta. So why did Fred Rwigyema say yes to joining Museveni's rebel group? Well, his motivations aren't fully known. Maybe it was a way for him to escape some of the growing hostility toward Banyarwanda in Uganda. Or maybe at just 19 years old, he simply was looking for an adventure. But what we do know is this: during those early days in Fronasa, Fred Rwigyema formed a bond that would last a lifetime. He met another young recruit named Caleb Akandwanao, later known to the world as General Salim Saleh, the younger brother of Yoweri Museveni. Their friendship became legendary. Some people even described them as inseparable. They were the youngest in the group, too young to even leave the training compound. It was also during this period that Fred Rwigyema would finally meet the man whose rebel group he was fighting for, Yoweri Museveni himself. In a later interview, Yoweri Museveni recalled a recruitment mission in Nairobi in 1976. Museveni says, "I received, among others, a group of 3 boys from Barara High School. One of them was Gisa, whom we gave the bush name Rwigyema." The name had significance. Cuban diplomats in Dar had once spoken to Yoweri Museveni about a brave Tutsi fighter who had stood by Che Guevara in Congo. His name, Gabriel Rwigyema. Yoweri Museveni saw something in Fred: resilience, loyalty, fearlessness. At the same time, his ethnicity as a Munyarwanda wasn't a concern to Yoweri Museveni, who considered Fronasa as a Pan-African movement. Fred Rwigyema would become one of just 28 fighters to undergo advanced training in Montepuez, Mozambique, with support from Frelimo and Mozambican President Samora Machel. That group of 28, small, quiet, determined, would become the backbone of Fronasa. In 1978, Fred returned briefly to western Uganda. He reunited with Kagame and with family who had begun to fear the worst. For years, they had no news of him. His sudden return felt like a resurrection. But there was no time to celebrate. Fred returned to the front lines almost immediately, fighting alongside Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles to push Idi Amin out of power. This war gave Fred his first real taste of combat. He learned what it meant to lead under fire, to carry the weight of others in the most dangerous moments. But this was just one chapter in a much longer struggle, because even before the dust had settled, Fred Rwigyema would soon find himself fighting alongside Yoweri Museveni to topple Milton Obote, who was now back in power. When Idi Amin fell in 1979, many hoped it would be the beginning of a new era in Uganda. A new national army was formed, the Uganda National Liberation Army, or the UNLA, made up of fighters from the various anti-Amin groups. But there was a catch. Fred Rwigyema and his fellow Rwandan exiles, many of whom had risked their lives in the fight against Amin, were left out. Labeled as foreigners, they were denied a place in the very army they had helped create. It was a bitter irony. Luckily for them, not everyone was blind to their contributions. Yoweri Museveni, who had fought alongside Fred, knew his worth. He kept Fred close by, making him part of his personal security detail alongside other trusted fighters like Paul Kagame. Having said that, Fred Rwigyema was no ceremonial bodyguard. He and Salim Saleh, Museveni's younger brother, had earned reputations as fearless frontline soldiers. Many years later, Museveni's son, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, would speak of Fred Rwigyema with admiration. Muhoozi says, "I was around him a lot as a child. He was part of my father's bodyguard." It was that admiration, Muhoozi said, that later inspired him to join the army. Now, even as Museveni held the reins of the defense ministry, his political future was in flux. Under Obote's government, he bounced from one government role to the next, from Minister of Defense to Regional Cooperation. In the 1980 elections, Museveni ran for president. But the results of these elections were widely condemned as rigged. Milton Obote was declared the winner. However, Museveni, along with others, refused to accept the outcome. And so, it was in this context that Museveni drew a group of loyal fighters, among them Fred Rwigyema and Paul Kagame, and withdrew from the government. In secret, they formed the Popular Resistance Army and they began planning for war. Eventually, that force merged with others to become the National Resistance Army, the NRA, with a political wing known as the National Resistance Movement. But as the NRA prepared for battle, Milton Obote's regime was already repeating the past. Obote's second term in power brought a surge in ethnic hostility. Rwandan refugees once again became targets, accused, harassed and attacked. Militias, youth groups, and even the National Army turned on them. For Fred Rwigyema and Paul Kagame, this wasn't just about Uganda anymore. This was personal. On February 6, 1981, the first shot of Museveni's rebellion was fired. The NRA attacked a military base at Kabamba. Fred Rwigyema and Paul Kagame were there. From the very first battle, Fred Rwigyema emerged as one of the movement's most capable field commanders. Because of this, he was soon placed in charge of the Montlana unit and later promoted to deputy commander of the NRA's elite 1st Mobile Force. This mobile force launched offensives, reinforced collapsing fronts, and carried the weight of Museveni's guerrilla war. In February 1983, that war hit a turning point. During fierce fighting at Bukalabi, General Salim Saleh was seriously wounded. Fred Rwigyema watched as his closest friend was carried off the battlefield. This battle at Bukalabi had cost him nearly a dozen senior fighters. But well, Fred Rwigyema pressed on. In 1984, he led Safari Rwenzori, a daring evacuation of wounded soldiers and civilians across treacherous terrain to the Rwenzori mountains. This exercise was a test of leadership and logistics, and Fred Rwigyema passed both. By March 1985, the NRA had opened a second front, the Western Axis. Yoweri Museveni appointed Fred Rwigyema as its commander. That same year, Fred Rwigyema and Kagame were once again shoulder to shoulder, this time moving from the Luwero Triangle toward the highlands of the Rwenzoris. Many years later, Paul Kagame would say of the time that Fred Rwigyema was unshakable, calm under pressure, decisive in chaos. Fred Rwigyema was the kind of leader you follow not because you're told, but because you want to. Now, back in Kampala, the Obote regime was falling apart. Internal rivalries had fractured the UNLA. In July 1985, Milton Obote was overthrown, again this time by General Tito Okello. But the momentum was already with Museveni's NRA. By January 1986, Museveni's forces entered Kampala. They'd emerged victorious.
I, Yoweri Museveni, do solemnly swear that I will well and truly exercise the functions of the High Office of the President of the Republic of Uganda, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Republic of Uganda, and that I will preserve and defend the Constitution, and that I will do right to all manner of people according to the law established, without fear or favor, affection or ill will, so help me God.
By the time the NRA captured Kampala, it had 15,000 fighters within its ranks. Roughly 3,000 of them were Rwandan Tutsis, many of them refugees who had once been told they didn't belong. Fred Rwigyema, still in his 20s, became the deputy army commander. In 1988, he was promoted to Deputy Minister of Defense and named a Major General when ranks were formally introduced. One of his best friends, Paul Kagame, was now head of military intelligence. Another Rwandese, Peter Bayingana, led the medical corps, and one other prominent Rwandese, Chris Bunyenyezi, commanded a frontline brigade. So by now, many Rwandan refugees held senior positions in Uganda's army and government. But ordinary refugees still lived under threat without legal protection or peace of mind. And public sentiment was turning. Some accused Museveni's NRA of being a foreign force of Rwandan mercenaries. The backlash grew stronger in 1988. Museveni responded. Several prominent Rwandan officers were quietly sidelined. In 1989, Museveni relieved Fred Rwigyema of his position as Deputy Minister of Defense. Museveni then offered Fred a chance to attend a military course in the United States. Fred Rwigyema declined. Instead, it was Paul Kagame who eventually went for the course. Even after being sidelined, Fred Rwigyema and Paul Kagame remained deeply embedded in Uganda's military machine. At the same time, the two men and many other Rwandese were still yearning for a place called home, Rwanda. And so, if anything, their demotions pushed them to act faster, to start preparing in silence for a mission to return home. Fred Rwigyema and Kagame joined the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, a refugee-led movement that had existed under different names since the 1970s. Fred Rwigyema quickly rose to the top, becoming its leader even as he continued to serve in Uganda's army. By 1990, the RPF had built a fighting force of over 3,000, most of them young, highly motivated exiles. At the same time, Juvenal Habyarimana's regime in Rwanda was slowly showing signs of weakness. This is what led Fred and the rest of the RPF to believe that the window had opened. And so they began planning for an operation they named Option Z, with the operation meant to invade Rwanda and start a guerrilla war. The date to invade Rwanda was set, October 1, 1990. But what was supposed to be a lightning advance collapsed almost immediately. Just 2 days in the operation, tragedy struck. Fred Rwigyema, the face of the RPF, its commander, and its unifying force, was shot dead in battle. After this tragedy, the rebel forces were forced to retreat, pushed into open savanna, where they were dangerously exposed to Rwanda's army, the FAR. The RPF were outgunned, outflanked, and eventually forced back across the Ugandan border. In the span of days, the RPF had lost 1,800 fighters and their leader, Fred Rwigyema. Suffice to say, Fred's death shattered the momentum of the invasion. Without him, the entire operation teetered on collapse. Thousands of miles away, Paul Kagame was in the middle of advanced military training in the United States. When news of Fred's death reached him, he didn't hesitate. He returned to Africa immediately. Paul Kagame landed in Uganda and assumed control of what remained of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And as you know, the rest is history. Major General Emmanuel Gisa, Fred Rwigyema, never lived to see the RPF's eventual success or Rwanda's transformation into what it is today, but his legacy remains. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.